I bought a house with zero HOA. No rules.
No dudas.
Then a stranger let herself into my living room. She called herself the HOA president of Brookhaven Estates. I told her I wasn't part of her HOA. She smiled. 6 months later, I was fighting for my house in court. The woman had a master key to half the street. What I found in her storage unit changed everything. By the end, one of us was leaving in handcuffs. My name is Nora Calloway, 34, an ER nurse and single mom to an 8-year-old named Ben. 2 years ago, I scraped together a down payment and bought a small brick ranch on Fern Hollow Road, the one street in town explicitly outside any homeowners association boundary. That was the whole point. I chose Fern Hollow because the listing said no HOA, no restrictions, just peace. After watching my mother spend a decade fighting an association over paint colors and mailbox posts, I wanted exactly one thing from a house, nobody telling me what to do with it. I thought I'd finally found that. Fern Hollow Road sits at the dead end of a much bigger development called Brookhaven Estates. 40-some houses behind a stone gate with a fountain that never quite worked right. My 5 houses were older, built before Brookhaven existed, grandfathered out when the association formed.
Neighbors called us.
The woman who ran Brookhaven's HOA was Deborah Voss, and everyone on Fern Hollow already knew her name before I moved a single box inside. My real estate agent actually laughed when I mentioned the street. Debbie Voss, she said, queen of measuring your grass with a ruler. I met Deborah for the first time 3 days after closing, when she walked up my driveway holding a clipboard and introduced herself as the voice of the neighborhood. I told her, politely, that my house wasn't in Brookhaven. She nodded slowly, like she already knew something I didn't. Of course, dear, she said, just wanted to welcome you. But her eyes moved past me into my open garage, cataloging boxes, furniture, my late father's old tool bench, like she was taking inventory of something that belonged to her. I chalked it up to nosy neighbor energy and let it go. The previous owner, Harold Denby, had lived in my house for almost 30 years. He'd sold to me quickly, almost eagerly, and left no forwarding address with the title company. My agent mentioned he'd seemed in a hurry to be somewhere else. At the time, that detail meant nothing to me. Within my first month, I noticed a car idling at the curb some evenings. Engine off, headlights off, just sitting. I assumed it was someone waiting to pick up a teenager from a nearby house. It happened often enough that I stopped noticing it, which in hindsight was exactly the mistake she wanted. A woman 2 doors down, Priya, caught me at the mailbox and asked, carefully, has Debbie been by yet? When I said just once, Priya's face did something complicated. Watch your mail, she said. And maybe get better locks. She wouldn't explain further and hurried back inside. I laughed it off to my sister on the phone that night. Some HOA lady thinks I owe her allegiance, I said. I'm not even in her HOA. My sister, who dealt with her own buildings board, told me associations like that rarely respect a boundary line they didn't personally approve. 2 weeks later, a laminated notice appeared taped to my front door. Lawn height violation. Brookhaven Estates community standards. My lawn was 4 inches tall. Nothing unusual. And more importantly, not her jurisdiction. I peeled it off, photographed it, and told myself this was a one-time clerical mix-up. I called the HOA's listed office number to sort out the confusion. A tired-sounding woman named Pam, the treasurer, answered and seemed genuinely puzzled. Fern Hollow isn't on our roster, she confirmed. I'll flag it for Debbie. Something in her tone suggested flagging things for Debbie rarely went anywhere. Then, my son mentioned offhand that the flower lady had waved at him from our backyard fence one afternoon while I was at work. I asked him to describe her. Gray bob, pearl earrings, clipboard. My stomach tightened in a way I didn't yet have words for. I installed a basic doorbell camera that weekend, more out of general caution than suspicion of any one person. The app pinged twice that first night with motion-detected alerts from my own driveway. Time-stamped 11:47 p.m. The footage showed nothing but a shadow crossing the frame, too fast to identify. At the grocery store, I ran into Harold Denby's old neighbor, an elderly man named Walt, who asked how I liked the house. When I mentioned Deborah's visits, Walt's expression shifted. Harold sold fast for a reason, he muttered, then changed the subject before I could press him further. I told myself I was being paranoid, that a big move with a new job schedule and a kid starting third grade was enough stress without inventing enemies. Still, I started locking the deadbolt during the day, something I'd never bothered with in 12 years of city apartment living. A quiet instinct forming. By the end of my first month on Fern Hollow, I had a laminated violation notice I didn't legally owe, a neighbor warning me in riddles, a strange car outside some nights, and a son who'd met a woman with a clipboard in our backyard. The piece I'd paid for was already cracking. The real spark came on a Tuesday. I got home from a double shift, exhausted, and found my living room lamp on, a lamp I distinctly remembered switching off that morning. My heart lurched before logic caught up. Maybe Ben's sitter had turned it on. She hadn't. Standing by my bookshelf, calmly reading the spines like she was browsing a library, was Deborah Voss. She turned to me, unbothered, clipboard tucked under one arm. Your porch light's been out 3 nights, she said, as if this explained everything. I wanted to make sure you were all right. I asked her, voice shaking, how she'd gotten inside. She held up a brass key between 2 fingers. Harold left it with the association years ago. For emergencies, she said. Force of habit, I suppose. She said it lightly, like handing me a compliment instead of a confession. I demanded the key back on the spot. She surrendered it with a small, tolerant smile, the kind adults give a child throwing a tantrum over nothing important. No harm done, she said. We look out for our neighbors here. I did not feel looked out for. I felt violated. That night I called a locksmith and had every exterior lock on the house rekeyed before Ben went to bed. I also called the local police non-emergency line to report the trespass. The officer who came by was polite but explained that without proof of forced entry, it was a gray area. Did she damage anything? Officer asked. No. And no. Then honestly, ma'am, it's mostly a civil matter unless it happens again. I thanked him, closed the door, and stood in my new locked house feeling less safe than I had in any city apartment I'd ever rented. I texted Priya to ask if this was the watch your mail warning she'd meant. Her reply came fast. That's exactly it. She did the same thing to the Ferraros before they moved. Told everyone she was just checking on the place. I asked who the Ferraros were. She didn't answer. The next morning I found a second laminated notice. This one about my mailbox post, which apparently violated a community standard that, again, did not apply to my address. I began keeping a folder of photos, timestamps, notices, not sure yet what I'd use it for, only that instinct told me to document everything. At school pickup, another Fern Hollow parent, a soft-spoken man named Curtis, mentioned he'd once gotten a friendly visit from Deborah about his fence stain color. "I'm not in the HOA either," he said, shrugging. "Doesn't seem to matter to her. She acts like the whole street's hers." I dug through my closing documents that weekend, every page, looking for anything connecting my property to Brookhaven Estates. Nothing. My plat map showed Fern Hollow clearly outside the association boundary, hand-drawn dotted line and all. On paper, Deborah Voss had absolutely no authority over my home. Still, the notices kept coming: mailbox, lawn edging, a wind chime she claimed was audibly disruptive. Each one felt less like a mistake and more like a message. "I see you. I'm watching. I decide what happens on this street, boundary line or not." The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. I emailed the HOA board directly, CCING Pam, the treasurer, formally requesting in writing that Deborah cease contact with my property. Pam replied within the hour, apologetic, promising to raise it at the next meeting. Deborah did not reply at all. Her silence felt louder than any excuse would have. 3 days later, my new doorbell camera caught her again. This time at 6 a.m., crouched at my flower bed adjusting something. When I reviewed the footage that evening, I realized she'd planted a small decorative sign reading "Welcome to Brookhaven" in my own garden bed, like she was quietly rewriting my address. I pulled the sign, photographed it, and added it to my folder. Ben asked why the flower lady kept coming back even after I told her not to. I didn't have a good answer for an 8-year-old. The honest one, that some adults simply don't accept no, felt too heavy to say aloud. A neighbor 2 streets over, whom I'd never met, stopped me at the coffee shop to say she'd heard the new Fern Hollow girl was causing trouble with Debbie. I hadn't caused anything. I'd asked a woman to stop entering my house uninvited. Somehow, in Brookhaven's telling, that made me the problem. That was the first time I understood the shape of what I was dealing with. Not a mistake, not overzealous friendliness, but a woman who had spent years building a version of reality where she was always right, always welcome, and always owed deference, and an entire community too tired to correct her. I decided that night, folder open on my kitchen table, photos spread out like evidence in a case I hadn't yet realized I was building, that I would not be the next name people whispered about the way they'd whispered about the Ferraros. Whatever this was, I intended to win it. The notices escalated in frequency, 3 in 1 week, each pettier than the last. One cited my recycling bin for being visible outside collection hours, despite my address having no collection agreement with Brookhaven at all. I began photographing the bin itself. Empty street, no other cans in sight, timestamps included. I brought my folder to Pam in person, sitting across from her at a diner near the highway, away from Brookhaven's gate. She looked through the photos with visible discomfort. "This isn't the first complaint file like this," she admitted quietly. "There have been others." What paperwork? I asked. Pam hesitated, then said Deborah kept her own private records on residence violations, disputes, personal notes, separate from official HOA files, stored somewhere only she had access to. She calls it her archive, Pam said. Like the word itself made her uneasy. I asked Pam directly whether my address had ever, legally, been part of Brookhaven Estates. She pulled up the county plat records on her phone right there at the table. Fern Hollow was clearly excluded, dotted boundary line exactly where my own copy showed it. You're right, she said. That confirmation should have felt like a relief. Instead, it made everything worse, because it meant Deborah wasn't confused. She knew time and decided the boundary line didn't matter to her personally. That distinction, mistake versus choice, changed how frightened I allowed myself to be. The following weekend, I hired a contractor to install a proper security system, cameras on all 4 corners of the house, sensor lights, a reinforced strike plate on the front door. Ben asked if we were being robbed. No, baby, I told him. Mommy just likes knowing who's outside. Deborah showed up the day the cameras went in, standing at the property line watching the installer work, arms crossed, saying nothing for almost 10 full minutes. When she finally spoke, it wasn't a threat. It was worse. All this trouble, she said, and left. That sentence sat with me for days. Not sorry for the confusion. Not, I'll stay off your property. Just an implication that my defenses were unnecessary, that whatever access she believed she had, cameras or not, she still intended to keep. I started sleeping with my phone charged beside the bed. I began asking around, carefully, about the Ferraros Priya had mentioned. An older Brookhaven resident named Ruth remembered them well, a young couple who'd lived 2 houses from Deborah before abruptly listing their home and moving out of state within 6 months of a misunderstanding over their driveway extension. Debbie said they'd violated setback rules, Ruth told me, sipping her coffee at the community garden where I'd tracked her down. But their house wasn't in Brookhaven either. Same as yours. Technicality like that stop her from getting what she wanted. My folder gained a new page. I found the Ferraros' new address through a mutual contact on social media and sent a careful, respectful message explaining who I was and why I was asking. Their reply came 2 days later. Guarded but honest. We didn't want to fight. We just wanted to leave. Good luck. You'll need it. That message haunted me more than any laminated notice ever could. 2 families before me had chosen retreat over confrontation, and Deborah had simply moved on to the next name on the street. I decided, sitting at my kitchen table that night, that I would not be family number 3. At work, exhausted between shifts, I started researching HOA law during my breaks, learning terms like adverse possession, trespass, and civil harassment restraining order. None of it was designed for my exact situation, a person outside an HOA being harassed by someone who acted as if the boundary simply didn't exist. I found a real estate attorney through a coworker's recommendation, a sharp, no-nonsense man named Mateo Reyes who, coincidentally, lived 4 houses down from me on Fern Hollow. When I called his office and mentioned Deborah Voss by name, there was a long pause before he simply said, "Come in Thursday." Sitting in Mateo's office, folder spread across his desk, He flipped through my photos with the focused calm of someone who'd seen this exact pattern before. She's done variations of this to at least 3 people I personally know, he said. Never anything provable enough to stick. Yet, Mateo explained that Deborah's tactic wasn't accidental. It relied on volume and exhaustion. Enough small violations. Enough uninvited visits. Enough plausible deniability moments. And most people simply gave up rather than fight a battle that felt too petty to justify a lawyer. You documenting everything, he said. That's what beats her. He advised me to send one final formal cease and desist letter. Certified mail. Laying out the property boundary. The trespass incident. And a clear statement that further unauthorized entry would result in legal action. I signed it that same afternoon, hands steadier than I expected them to be. The letter went out on a Friday. By Monday, the tone on Fern Hollow had visibly shifted, not toward peace, but toward something colder. Deborah stopped leaving notices on my door. Instead, I started noticing her at community events, at the mailbox cluster, watching me with an expression I could only call patient. Priya warned me that patient was worse than angry with Deborah. Angry. She yells and it blows over, Priya said. Patient means she's planning something. I didn't fully understand what that meant yet, but the warmth had gone out of the neighborhood entirely, and I felt it in every interaction now. Ben came home from a friend's birthday party at a Brookhaven house and mentioned, casually, that Mrs. Voss had asked him a lot of questions. What time I got home from work, whether I had a boyfriend, whether anyone else lived with us. My blood went cold in a way I hadn't felt before. I called the birthday party's host mother to gently ask why Deborah had been interviewing my 8-year-old. She sounded embarrassed. She does that with all the kids, the mother admitted. Asks about schedules, who's coming and going. We all just thought it was her being nosy. I never really questioned it. That was the moment the fear stopped being abstract. This wasn't about lawn height or mailbox posts anymore. Someone was building a profile of my household routine through my own son, and I had no legal recourse yet. Nothing but a folder of photographs and a lawyer telling me to wait and document. I stopped letting Ben attend any gathering inside Brookhaven's gates without me present. A decision that cost him a few playdates and cost me guilt I didn't deserve to carry. Mateo agreed it was the right call. Until we have something concrete, he said. Assume she's still watching every move you make. I asked Mateo the question that had been circling my mind for weeks. Why? Why fixate this hard on one family outside her own jurisdiction? He didn't have an answer yet. Only a theory. People like her aren't protecting property values, he said.
They're protecting a feeling of control.
I started noticing small, strange details I'd previously dismissed. Deborah's own house, visible from the Brookhaven gate. Always immaculate. Always staged like a model home nobody actually lived in. Not a single object out of place. Not a single sign of a life being lived. It struck me as sad more than sinister. Briefly, a Brookhaven board member named Sal, who I'd met once at a community cleanup day, pulled me aside at the grocery store to say quietly that the board was having its own issues with Deborah's bookkeeping, though he wouldn't elaborate further, glancing around like the parking lot itself might report back to her. I mentioned this to Mateo, who leaned back in his chair with the first real smile I'd seen from him. If there's financial trouble under the surface, he said. That's a thread. People like her don't just overreach on lawns. Control usually starts somewhere with a $sign attached to it. That night I couldn't sleep, running scenarios, wondering what exactly Deborah might be hiding behind her spotless lawn and laminated notices. My son slept soundly down the hall, unaware his mother was quietly assembling a case against the flower lady, who'd once asked him too many questions at a birthday party. The following week, my camera caught Deborah's car parked at the curb again at midnight, engine off, exactly like those early sightings I'd once dismissed. This time I had footage, timestamp, license plate, everything. I sent it directly to Mateo with one line. She's still doing it. Now I can prove it. Mateo forwarded the footage to a friend at the county sheriff's department, someone he trusted to actually take a stalking complaint seriously instead of shrugging it off as a civil matter. Within days, a deputy came by to formally log the incident and take a statement, the first official record on file. Deborah, somehow, heard about the deputy's visit within 24 hours. Small neighborhoods talk fast, and the very next morning I found a bouquet of flowers on my porch with a card reading, "So glad we're neighbors. Let's put the silly misunderstandings behind us. Debbie." Flowers. I photographed the card for the folder and left the flowers exactly where they sat until they wilted. A small, petty act of defiance that felt disproportionately satisfying. Mateo called it textbook, a manipulator softening the record right after being reported, building a paper trail of her own manufactured goodwill. Curtis, the fence-stained neighbor, texted me a photo of his own, a HOA newsletter, official Brookhaven letterhead, that listed welcoming our Fern Hollow friends to the neighborhood in the community notes. My name included, as if my household had voluntarily joined an association I had never once agreed to be part of. I forwarded the newsletter to Mateo immediately. He read it twice, jaw tightening. "This isn't sloppy anymore," he said. "This is someone building a paper record that makes it look, on the surface, like you consented to Brookhaven's authority. That's not carelessness. That's strategy." We requested Brookhaven's official meeting minutes through Pam, who by now had quietly become something like an ally, sneaking me documents she probably shouldn't have. Buried in an old set of minutes was a line item, Fern Hollow annexation discussed, pending signatures. My name was nowhere on it. Harold Denby's was. I stared at Harold's signature on the scanned minutes for a long time. It looked plausible, cursive, confident, except I had his actual signature from the closing documents, and the loops didn't match. Not even close. I texted the comparison photos to Mateo at 11 that night. "That's not his signature," Mateo confirmed the next morning, having pulled Harold's notarized closing paperwork himself. "If she forged an annexation document with a dead deal to make it look like your house voluntarily joined Brookhaven, that's not a neighbor dispute anymore. That's fraud." Than I expected. I finally understood the shape of what had actually happened. Harold hadn't sold quickly because he was simply retiring somewhere warmer. He'd sold quickly because he was trying to escape the exact same pressure I was now standing in the middle of, and he'd left before anyone could ask him harder questions. Mateo tracked down Harold Denby's actual forwarding address through the title company, and I made the call myself, hands sweating around the phone. Harold answered warily, and when I said Fern Hollow and Deborah Voss in the same sentence, His voice changed instantly. I wondered how long it'd take her, he said. Harold told me, quietly and with obvious relief at finally saying it aloud, that Deborah had pressured him for 2 years to voluntarily annex his lot into Brookhaven, insisting it would raise his property value. When he refused, the notices started, then the uninvited visits, then, eventually, he simply gave up and sold. For a short while after Harold's call, things on Fern Hollow went strangely quiet. No notices, no midnight cars, no clipboard visits. Priya said Deborah had been busy with board stuff the past 2 weeks. I let myself exhale for the first time in over a month. Cautiously, guardedly, but genuinely. Mateo warned me not to mistake silence for surrender. People like her don't stop, he said. They regroup. Still, I let Ben have a normal Saturday again. A birthday party outside Brookhaven's gates this time. And for one afternoon our house felt like the peaceful place I'd actually paid for. I used the lull to formally file a complaint with the county's HOA oversight office regarding the forged annexation document, attaching Harold's statement and the signature comparison. The clerk who took the complaint said these cases moved slowly, sometimes months, but that fraud allegations against a sitting HOA president were taken seriously. Pam quietly told me the board had scheduled a closed-door session to review some financial irregularities flagged during a routine audit request she'd made months earlier, one Deborah had repeatedly postponed. She's been stalling that audit for over a year, Pam admitted.
I always assumed it was...
I asked Pam what kind of irregularities. She wouldn't say specifics yet, only that the number didn't reconcile, and that Deborah controlled both the HOA's bank login and its physical filing cabinet personally. An arrangement Pam now realized should have concerned her far earlier than it actually had. 2 weeks into the quiet, I got a text from an unknown number. You should really let this go. For your son's sake. No name. No context. I forwarded it straight to the sheriff's deputy handling my earlier complaint, who logged it as a possible intimidation attempt tied to the ongoing case. The deputy traced the number to a prepaid phone purchased with cash at a drugstore 2 towns over, untraceable to any specific person, but flagged as consistent with the kind of burner used in harassment cases. It wasn't proof of anything. It was, however, one more thread pulling toward the same tangled center. I told Mateo about the text over coffee, and for the first time since I'd hired him, I saw something like genuine worry cross his face instead of calm professional confidence. This is escalating faster than her usual pattern, he said. Whatever she's protecting, she's starting to feel cornered by it. I started varying my routine slightly, different route home, different grocery store some weeks, dropping Ben off 5 minutes earlier than usual. Felt paranoid and exhausting, and I hated that a woman with a clipboard had turned my ordinary life into something requiring tactical planning. But I did it anyway. Ruth, the older Brookhaven resident, stopped me at the community garden again, this time with a folder of her own old newsletters, meeting notes, photographs spanning nearly a decade of Deborah's presidency. All of it quietly saved just in case, she said. Someone finally asked the right questions. Ruth's folder revealed a pattern stretching back years. At least 4 families, including the Ferraros and now Harold, who'd left the area shortly after disputes with Deborah. Each one preceded by escalating notices, uninvited visits, and eventually, in 2 cases, Mysterious, voluntary annexation paperwork nobody could quite remember signing. Why didn't anyone report her sooner? I asked Ruth, genuinely baffled. She sighed, the particular sigh of someone who'd asked herself the same question many times. Because individually, none of it looks like much, she said. A pushy neighbor. It only looks like a pattern once you line it all up. I spent an entire weekend lining it up, building a timeline on my kitchen wall with sticky notes and string, feeling equal parts investigator and exhausted single mother who just wanted her Saturday back. Mateo photographed the whole wall for his own case file, calling it genuinely the clearest pattern I've ever seen. The quiet ended on a Tuesday night in the ugliest way possible. Ben came home from a friend's house upset, saying the flower lady had told him our house wasn't really ours to keep, and that he shouldn't get too attached to his room. I called Mateo before I even finished putting Ben to bed. Mateo's voice was flat and serious when I described what Deborah had said to my son. That's not a boundary dispute anymore, he said. That's a targeted intimidation of a minor, and it changes what we can pursue immediately. He advised filing for an emergency protective order the very next morning. I sat in the family courthouse the following day. Ben's words replayed on a loop in my head, filling out paperwork for a civil harassment restraining order against a woman I'd met exactly 6 months earlier over a laminated lawn notice. The clerk barely blinked. Apparently this wasn't her first HOA-related filing. The judge granted a temporary order that same week, barring Deborah from contact with me, my property, or my son pending a full hearing. When Mateo called with the news, I cried in my car in the hospital parking lot before my shift. Relief and rage tangled together in equal measure. Deborah, served with the order at her own front door according to a neighbor who witnessed it, reportedly told the process server, "This is absurd. I've done nothing but protect this community." The neighbor said her voice carried down the whole cul-de-sac, sharp enough that several other doors quietly opened to listen. For 3 days, the order held. Then my cameras caught her car circling the block twice at a distance, never quite entering Fern Hollow itself, technically staying just outside the order's radius while making her presence unmistakably known. Mateo filed the footage as evidence of the order being tested, if not outright violated. Pam called me late one evening, voice trembling, to say the closed-door audit session had finally happened, and the numbers were worse than irregular. Roughly $80,000 in HOA reserve funds, meant for road repairs and the fountain restoration, appeared to be unaccounted for over the past 3 fiscal years. I asked Pam the obvious question, where did she think it went? Pam hesitated a long time before answering. "There's a storage unit," she finally said. "Debbie's had one for years, off the books, that she pays for personally. I always assumed it was just old furniture. Now I'm not so sure." Mateo, working alongside Pam and Sal now as the board quietly turned against its own president, subpoenaed the storage facility's rental records as part of the growing civil case. The unit had been rented under Deborah's name alone for 6 years, paid in cash, never once listed on any HOA financial disclosure. Tyler Voss, Deborah's adult son and, unbeknownst to me until that point, a member of the HOA board himself as recording secretary, reached out to Mateo directly, asking to meet privately. When they sat down, Tyler brought a laptop full of financial spreadsheets he'd been quietly compiling for over a year. Tyler explained, visibly shaken, that he'd first started suspecting his mother of mismanaging funds after noticing discrepancies in a spreadsheet she'd asked him to help format for a board presentation. Numbers that didn't add up. Vendor invoices for work he'd never actually seen completed around the neighborhood. Small enough to overlook at first. I told myself it was probably nothing, Tyler admitted to Mateo. She's my mom. Of her that's just intense. Not the version that's actually doing something wrong, but the intimidation of an 8-year-old, he said, was the line he couldn't rationalize away anymore. Tyler's spreadsheet, cross-referenced against Pam's audit and the storage unit's rental history, painted a clear picture. Fabricated vendor invoices, HOA checks routed to, accounts controlled by Deborah personally, and years of dues quietly siphoned under the cover of landscaping and security consulting contracts that never actually existed. I sat with this information at my kitchen table, staring at printouts Mateo had brought over personally, and felt something shift from fear into a colder, steadier kind of resolve. This wasn't just about my house anymore. Dozens of families had been quietly paying into Deborah Voss's personal fund for years without knowing it. Mateo explained that once fraud and embezzlement entered the picture, this stopped being purely a civil matter and became something the county district attorney's office would want to know about directly. He scheduled a meeting with an assistant DA who specialized in financial crimes, bringing Tyler's spreadsheets and Ruth's decade of documentation. The assistant DA, a sharp woman named Renata Cho, reviewed the case file for nearly 2 hours without saying much, then finally looked up and said, "This is one of the more thorough citizen-built cases I've seen come through this office." I didn't know whether to feel proud or exhausted. Both. Probably. Renata explained the process ahead. A formal investigation. Subpoenas for bank records. Likely a search warrant for the storage unit. And eventually, if the evidence held, criminal charges spanning embezzlement, fraud, and potentially stalking and violation of a protective order, given the restraining order breach already on camera. Deborah, apparently sensing the walls closing in, escalated instead of retreating. My cameras caught her at the edge of my property line again 3 nights later, this time on foot, moving slowly along the fence line with what looked like a flashlight, well past midnight, clearly avoiding the front-facing camera angles. I called the emergency line immediately, and a deputy arrived within 12 minutes to find Deborah still crouched near my backyard fence, claiming she'd lost her cat in the area, despite Priya confirming, when asked, that Deborah had never owned a pet in the 11 years she'd lived in Brookhaven. The deputy arrested her on the spot for violating the active protective order. The first time in this entire saga that Deborah Voss faced any consequence with actual teeth. I watched from my window as she was placed in the back of a patrol car, still insisting, loudly, that she'd done nothing wrong. Word spread through Brookhaven overnight. By morning, my inbox held messages from residents I'd never even met, some apologetic, some defensive of Deborah, most simply stunned that the woman who'd run their community with an iron clipboard for over a decade had been hauled away in handcuffs over a supposed missing cat. Deborah made bail within hours, released on conditions that included staying away from my property entirely, no exceptions this time, enforced with the weight of a criminal case rather than a civil order she could quietly test the edges of. Still, I didn't feel safe. Not yet. Still unresolved. Frank Voss, Deborah's husband, showed up at my door 2 days later, unannounced but visibly nervous, hands raised slightly as if to prove he meant no harm. "I'm not here to defend her," he said quietly. "I'm here because I think you should know what you're actually dealing with." I let him in. Cautiously, Matteo on speakerphone in my pocket the entire time. Frank sat at my kitchen table and told me things about his wife he'd apparently never said aloud to anyone. That Deborah had lost their previous home to foreclosure 15 years earlier, a humiliation she'd never once discussed since. "She rebuilt everything around control after that," Frank said. "The HO, the rules, the clipboard, it wasn't really about lawns. It was about never feeling powerless in a neighborhood again. I told myself for years it was just her personality. I think I just didn't want to see how far it had gone." Frank confirmed the storage unit existed, said he'd once glimpsed inside it years ago, filing boxes labeled with street names, folders on individual families, photographs, printed emails, all of it organized with an obsessive precision he'd found unsettling even then but had never questioned out loud. "I should have said something," he admitted. I asked Frank directly whether he knew about the forged annexation signature on Harold's old documents. He went quiet for a long moment before nodding. "She said it was just paperwork to smooth things over," he said. I told myself that meant nothing. I think I've told myself that about a lot of things. Frank's visit gave Matteo's case another crucial piece. A spouse's first-hand corroboration of the storage unit's existence and its contents, strengthening the search warrant application Renata Cho was already preparing. Frank agreed, somewhat to his own visible surprise, to provide a formal statement to investigators the following week. That same evening, Priya knocked on my door with 2 other Brookhaven residents I barely knew, all 3 holding printed copies of old violation notices they'd quietly kept over the years, small individual grievances that, lined up together, formed one more layer of Ruth's pattern spanning nearly the entire neighborhood. "We should have compared notes years ago," one of them, a woman named Denise, said, shaking her head at her own kitchen table folder. "We all just assumed it was our own personal bad luck with her. Never occurred to any of us it was happening to everyone at once." I understood that feeling completely, with Frank's statement, Tyler's spreadsheets, Pam's audit, Ruth's decade of documentation, and my own camera footage combined. Renata Cho's office secured a search warrant for Deborah's storage unit within the week. Matteo asked, as a courtesy, whether I wanted to be present when it was executed. I said yes without hesitation. I stood at a respectful distance in the storage facility's parking lot as deputies cut the lock and rolled up the unit's door, revealing rows of labeled bankers' boxes stretching back into the dark. Fern Hollow, Ferraro, Denby, and, chillingly, a box simply labeled Callaway. Already started, already half full. Inside my own box, printed photos of my house taken from angles I hadn't even noticed cameras from. Copies of my mail apparently photographed before delivery. A printed page listing Ben's school schedule. And a handwritten note reading persistent. Needs pressure. Watch the boy. Matteo had to steady me by the elbow. Renata Cho, present for the search personally given the case's growing scope, called it one of the more disturbing surveillance patterns she'd encountered in a case that started as an HOA dispute. The boxes on other families revealed the same pattern repeated for years, each one a quiet campaign most victims never fully understood. Deborah was arrested again that same afternoon, this time on expanded charges: stalking, unlawful surveillance, embezzlement, and forgery, layered on top of the existing protective order violation. Renata's office announced they intended to pursue every count fully, calling the storage unit evidence the clearest paper trail of premeditation she'd seen in years. The local news picked up the story within days. HOA president arrested in alleged surveillance, embezzlement scheme, and suddenly Deborah Voss's carefully manicured public image, the smiling clipboard carrying voice of the neighborhood, collapsed into headlines she could no longer control with a laminated notice or a bouquet of flowers. Reporters called me directly for comment, and after consulting Matteo, I agreed to a short, careful statement that I hoped exposing this pattern would help other families who'd been too afraid or too exhausted to speak up sooner. I did not mention Ben by name. Some protections, even now, felt worth insisting on. Brookhaven's remaining board members, Pam and Sal Chief among them, called an emergency community meeting to address the fallout, formally suspending Deborah's presidency pending trial and announcing an independent financial review to determine exactly how much of the missing $80,000 could realistically be recovered from her personal accounts. Tyler stood up at that meeting, visibly shaking, and read a short statement to a packed room of stunned neighbors, acknowledging his mother's actions and formally resigning his own board seat, out of respect for the trust this community deserves, and that my family failed to honor. The room was silent afterward. Ruth found me after the meeting and squeezed my hand without saying much. Just a long look that carried the weight of years of quiet fear finally being validated. "You did what the rest of us were too tired to do," she said. I told her it hadn't felt like courage. It had felt like survival. Harold Denby called me unprompted a few days later, having seen the news from wherever he'd relocated to. "I'm sorry I ran instead of fighting," he said. "Maybe if I had, you never would have had to deal with any of this." I told him he had nothing to apologize for. Fear isn't a moral failing. The Ferraros reached out too, this time with more warmth than their earlier cautious message, expressing genuine relief that someone had finally stopped Deborah for good. "We used to lie awake wondering if she'd done this to anyone after us," they wrote. "I'm sorry it had to be you. I'm glad it's over now." Frank Voss filed for divorce the same week the criminal charges were formally announced, telling Matteo through his own attorney that he could no longer stand behind a version of loyalty that meant protecting behavior like this. I felt an unexpected flicker of sympathy for him, a man who'd looked away too long and finally hadn't. Pam, now serving as interim HOA president, personally called to apologize for every notice, every laminated warning, every moment the board had failed to question Deborah's authority sooner. "We should have listened to Fern Hollow the first time someone complained," she said.
"Instead, we let one woman..."
The county's oversight office formally voided the fraudulent annexation document tied to Harold's forged signature, closing that particular thread for good. My house, on paper and now unmistakably in fact, had never belonged to Brookhaven Estates at any point, a truth Deborah had known and buried under paperwork for years. Matteo told me the criminal case against Deborah was likely headed toward a plea agreement rather than a full trial, given the sheer volume of evidence stacked against her: the storage unit, the spreadsheets, the forged signature, the camera footage, the restraining order violation caught in real time by a deputy. I asked him honestly whether a plea deal felt like enough after everything she'd put multiple families through. He was quiet for a moment before answering. "It's not about feeling like enough," he said. "It's about certainty. A trial risks a jury deciding a clipboard doesn't equal a crime." Renata Cho's office ultimately secured a plea agreement. Guilty to embezzlement, forgery, stalking, and violation of a protective order, with a recommended sentence including restitution to the HOA, a lengthy probation period, and a formal, permanent injunction barring Deborah from any HOA leadership role or unsupervised contact with minors on the block. I sat in the courtroom the day the plea was formally entered, watching Deborah Voss, smaller now, stripped of her clipboard and her title, dressed plainly instead of immaculately, say the word guilty for separate times in a flat, quiet voice utterly unlike the confident tone she'd once welcomed me to the neighborhood with. She did not look at me once during the hearing. I found, to my own surprise, that I didn't need her to. I'd spent months needing her acknowledgement, her apology, her admission that I'd been right all along. Watching her plead guilty on the record turned out to be enough. All by itself, outside the courthouse, Ruth, Priya, Denise, and several other Brookhaven residents I'd come to know only through this ordeal gathered around me. An unplanned little cluster of people who'd each carried some version of the same fear alone for years and were only now, finally, allowed to set it down together. Restitution was ordered at the full $80,000. To be repaid through liquidation of assets including Deborah's personal savings and, notably, the sale of the very Brookhaven house she'd spent years protecting with laminated notices and forged paperwork. Frank, already divorcing, agreed to the sale without contest. In the weeks before sentencing, Deborah, out on bail and technically barred from contact, somehow began sending letters through an intermediary, a cousin, apparently mailing them from a different town to avoid violating the order's letter while clearly violating its spirit. The letters arrived at my house despite everything already in motion. The first letter was almost pleading, insisting she'd only ever wanted to protect the neighborhood's standards, and that I didn't understand how hard she'd worked to build something out of nothing. I read it once, photographed it for Mateo, and did not respond. Engaging felt like exactly what she wanted. The second letter arrived a week later, his tone sharper, accusing me of destroying a life's work over a misunderstanding, and suggesting that Ben would grow up hearing his mother ruined a woman who only ever cared about the community. My hands shook reading that line, anger replacing the fear it was meant to cause. I brought both letters straight to Mateo and Renata Cho's office, and within days, the intermediary cousin was identified and warned that further correspondence on Deborah's behalf would constitute a direct violation of the protective order, regardless of who physically mailed the envelope. The letters stopped after that warning, abruptly and completely. Mateo explained that this kind of behavior, testing boundaries even after formal consequences were already stacking up, was, in his experience, almost inevitable with someone whose entire identity had been built around never being told no. People like her don't stop escalating, he said.
They just run out of tools.
Around this time, an investigative local reporter doing a longer feature on the case uncovered something Ruth's decade of documentation had only partially captured. Deborah had run a nearly identical playbook at a previous HOA, 2 counties over, roughly 17 years earlier, before relocating to Brookhaven under her maiden name variant. The reporter found old local newspaper archives describing a strikingly similar pattern: aggressive notices, uninvited entries, a mysteriously vanished portion of association funds, and at least one family who'd left the state entirely rather than continue fighting. No charges had ever been filed back then. Nobody had built a case the way we had. Reading that older article felt like looking into a mirror stretched across 17 years. Watching the exact same behavior play out on some other unlucky street with some other unlucky family who never got the resolution I was finally getting. It made the plea deal feel less like enough and more like overdue. I mentioned the older case to Renata Cho, wondering aloud whether it might be reopened. She explained gently that the statute of limitations had almost certainly expired on most of those older potential charges, but that the pattern itself would still be entered as evidence during sentencing to argue against any leniency. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, giving the community time to submit victim impact statements. Pam organized a quiet effort among affected families, Fern Hollow residents, the Ferraros by video call, Harold by written letter, and myself, each contributing our own account of what Deborah's years of control had actually cost us. Writing my own statement was harder than I expected. I sat at my kitchen table for 3 separate nights trying to compress months of fear, locked doors, rearranged routines, and a son who'd once been questioned about our schedule by a stranger, into something a judge would read in under 5 minutes. I ended up writing mostly about Ben, how he'd started double-checking that doors were locked before bed, a habit no 8-year-old should need, and how it would take longer than any court date to undo the quiet vigilance she'd taught him without ever once raising her voice. That felt like the truest harm. Mateo reviewed my draft and made almost no changes, which felt like its own small validation. Judges hear a lot of anger in these hearings, he said. What actually moves sentencing decisions is specificity. You gave them specificity. I hoped he was right. I hoped it would matter in the room that day. In the meantime, life on Fern Hollow began, cautiously, to normalize. The strange cars stopped appearing at the curb. The laminated notices stopped taping themselves to doors. Priya's kids started playing in the shared cul-de-sac again after dark. Something none of the parents had quite allowed themselves during Deborah's reign of quiet surveillance. Pam, still serving as interim HOA president, pushed through a series of reforms at the next general meeting. Mandatory dual sign-off on all HOA financial transactions, a public digital ledger of dues and expenditures, and an explicit written policy prohibiting board members from entering any residence property without written, dated, revocable consent. The reforms passed unanimously, a level of consensus Brookhaven apparently hadn't achieved on anything in over a decade. Sal joked, at the end of the meeting, that Deborah had accidentally united the neighborhood more thoroughly through scandal than any potluck or fountain fundraiser ever had. Nobody laughed, but nobody disagreed either. I started attending Brookhaven's meetings occasionally, as a guest rather than a member, invited by Pam, who felt Fern Hollow's perspective deserved a voice even without a formal vote. It felt strange sitting in rooms I'd once been forced into against my will, this time by my own choice, on my own terms. Tyler reached out once more before sentencing, this time not through Mateo but directly, asking if he could apologize to me in person rather than through a statement. I agreed, cautiously, and we met at the same diner where Pam had first shown me her plate map all those months earlier. Tyler's apology was awkward and unpolished in a way that felt more genuine than any polished statement could have. "I keep thinking about the box with your name on it," he said. "I should have looked harder. Sooner." I told myself protecting my mom and protecting the neighborhood were the same thing. They weren't. I told him I appreciated the apology, but that it belonged more to Ben than to me. Tyler nodded, understanding immediately, and asked if there was anything he could do to make things right for my son specifically. I didn't have an answer that day. I told him I'd think about it, and I did. Eventually, I suggested Tyler speak to Ben's school counselor about volunteering for the Neighborhood Watch program the Reform Board was setting up. Supervised,
transparent. Nothing like his mother's version of watching, as a way of putting his own name back into the community doing something honest instead of something hidden.
Ben, for his part, remained wary of Brookhaven's gate for a long while, flinching slightly whenever we drove past it even after everything was resolved. His therapist, whom we started seeing weekly during this period, said that kind of residual vigilance was normal and would fade with consistency, patience, and time. I threw myself into consistency deliberately. Same bedtime, same locked door routine explained simply as habit rather than fear. Same walk to school every morning past the very fence Deborah had once questioned him at. Slowly, week by week, I watched him relax back into being an ordinary, unguarded 8-year-old again. 3 weeks before sentencing, Deborah's defense attorney attempted a last-minute motion arguing diminished culpability, citing the foreclosure trauma Frank had described and a hastily arranged psychological evaluation. Renata Cho fought the motion aggressively, arguing that sympathy for a difficult past didn't erase a documented, deliberate, years-long pattern of premeditated harm. The judge denied the motion, ruling that while personal history could be considered during sentencing itself, it did not warrant reopening or weakening an already negotiated plea agreement built on overwhelming physical and financial evidence. Mateo called me immediately after the hearing, relief audible even through the phone. "It's holding," he said. "It's actually holding." Deborah's cousin, the letter intermediary, was quietly interviewed by investigators and admitted, under pressure, that Deborah had also asked her to look into whether Fern Hollow had any grounds to file a formal countersuit against the HOA, apparently still strategizing offense even while facing multiple felony counts of her own. That detail, more than almost anything else in the entire case, crystallized something for me about who Deborah actually was underneath the clipboard and the pearl earrings. Not someone capable of reflection, but someone who experienced every consequence purely as an obstacle to be strategized around rather than a truth to be reckoned with. I mentioned this realization to Mateo over what had become our now routine Thursday case update coffee, and he nodded slowly. "That's exactly why the reforms matter as much as the sentence," he said. "You can't therapy your way past someone like her. You can only build systems that make her particular skill set useless." Pam's new dual-signature financial policy caught its first real test that same month, when a routine landscaping invoice came in 20% higher than quoted. Under the old system, it would have quietly cleared with Deborah's sole approval. Under the new one, Sal caught the discrepancy within a day and had it corrected. "It's such a small thing," Pam said when she told me about it. "But it's the whole point. One person shouldn't be able to move money without a second set of eyes ever questioning it. We should have had this years ago. We just never had a reason to think we needed it." As sentencing approached, I found myself thinking less about anger and more about the strange, hollow exhaustion of having spent nearly a year fighting a battle I'd never asked for, over a house I'd bought specifically to avoid exactly this kind of conflict. The irony wasn't lost on me. It just felt heavy.
Mateo.
Sensing my exhaustion during one of our final prep meetings, told me something that stuck with me more than any legal strategy he'd offered all year. You didn't choose this fight, he said. But you're the reason it's actually ending instead of just moving on to whoever came after you on that street. The sentencing hearing itself was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, and I took the day off work, dressed carefully, drove to the courthouse with Mateo beside me, and a folder of victim impact statements in my bag that represented not just my own family, but Harold, the Ferraros, and dozens of quiet Brookhaven residents. The courtroom was fuller than I expected. Faces I recognized from a year of laminated notices and whispered warnings, all gathered now for something closer to resolution. Deborah sat at the defense table in a plain gray blazer. No clipboard, no pearl earrings, looking smaller than the woman who'd once stood in my living room. Renata Cho opened with a summary of the case, the storage unit, the forged signatures, the missing $80,000, the pattern stretching back 17 years into a life Deborah had rebuilt 3 separate times, each rebuild funded, in some measure, by the same tactics used against people who trusted their community's leadership. When it came time for victim impact statements, I stood at the podium with my hands steady despite the nervous flutter in my chest, and read the words I'd spent 3 nights writing, focusing on Ben, on locked doors, on a childhood quietly reshaped by a stranger's obsession with control disguised as care. Harold's letter was read aloud by the clerk in his absence, describing 30 years of building a life on Fern Hollow before feeling forced to abandon it in a matter of months. The Ferraros appeared by video call, their faces tight with old, still fresh discomfort, describing the exact same slow, suffocating pressure I had felt. Ruth spoke last among the victims, standing with the quiet authority of someone who'd watched this pattern unfold from the closest possible distance for over a decade without ever having the proof to stop it. She didn't just take our money, Ruth told the court.
She took our sense of safety.
Deborah's attorney made a brief statement citing her cooperation with the plea process and lack of prior convictions, careful not to directly minimize the harm described, aware the judge had already signaled little patience for excuses. Deborah herself was offered the chance to speak and, after a long pause, quietly declined. The judge, before announcing the sentence, addressed Deborah directly, noting that the case represented a profound and sustained abuse of a position of trust,
and that the storage unit's contents in particular demonstrated a level of premeditation.
The final sentence came down. 3 years in state custody with possibility of parole after 18 months given the plea cooperation. 5 years of supervised probation following release. Full restitution of $80,000. A lifetime ban from serving in any HOA leadership capacity. And a permanent no-contact order protecting my family specifically. I felt the room exhale around me as the sentence was read. A collective release of breath from people who'd carried some version of this fear for years without a name for it. Deborah was led out through a side door, and this time, unlike the earlier arrest, she did not look back at all. The days immediately after sentencing felt strangely anticlimactic. The way I imagined finishing a long, Difficult shift feels not triumphant, just quiet, just tired, just finally allowed to sit down. I picked Ben up from school that afternoon and we got ice cream for no reason other than that we finally could. Mateo sent a final invoice with a note attached. This one's on the house for the last few hours. You did more of the actual legwork than most of my paying clients ever do. I framed the note. Half joke and half genuine gratitude for a man who'd taken my folder seriously from day one. Pam called to let me know the Brookhaven board had voted to formally rename the neighborhood's small central fountain garden after no one in particular, deliberately choosing a plain plaque reading Community Trust Garden instead of any individual's name. We learned our lesson about putting one person on a pedestal, she said. The reformed HOA published its first fully transparent annual financial report that same season. Every line item visible to every resident. The same dual signature system catching 2 more minor discrepancies before they could grow into anything larger. Sal joked it was the most boring HOA report in Brookhaven's history. Everyone agreed that was the goal. Frank's divorce finalized quietly around the same time. The Brookhaven house sold as part of the restitution order to a young family who had no idea, until a neighbor eventually mentioned it. Exactly whose obsessive precision had once kept that lawn so unnaturally, unsettlingly perfect for so many years. Harold called one last time. This time just to talk. No legal matters left between us. He mentioned he'd started sleeping better for the first time in years, no longer waiting for a laminated notice that would never come again. Thank you, he said, for finishing the fight I didn't have it in me to start. Ben's therapist noted real progress that month. Fewer questions about locked doors. Fewer glances toward Brookhaven's gate on our drives to school. A return of the easy, unguarded laughter I'd almost forgotten was his default setting before any of this began. Watching him relax felt like its own quiet form of justice. Priya organized an informal Fern Hollow gathering in my backyard that spring. The first time the street had come together socially since I'd moved in. Kids running between the same fence Deborah had once questioned Ben at. Now just an ordinary fence again. No longer a place that held any particular meaning. Ruth brought her old folder to the gathering, only half joking that she wanted to formally retire it. And we ended up burning select pages in my fire pit together. A small, slightly absurd ceremony for 2 women who'd both spent far too long quietly documenting a threat nobody else wanted to believe was real. Tyler showed up briefly to the gathering too, invited by Pam, standing a bit awkwardly at the edge of the yard until Ben, unprompted, walked over and asked if he wanted to see his new bike. Watching my son extend that small grace on his own terms meant more to me than any courtroom victory had. I asked myself, more than once during that gathering, whether I felt like I'd won something. The honest answer was complicated. I hadn't wanted a fight. I'd anyone's rules. What I'd gotten instead was a neighborhood finally freed of a fear it hadn't fully understood it was carrying. Restitution payments began arriving on schedule, distributed proportionally among affected parties by the county's oversight office, mine covering the security system, legal fees, and a fraction of the therapy costs Ben and I had needed. No amount of money undid the year, but it felt, at least, like an acknowledgement on paper. The local paper ran a follow-up feature months later titled Life After the HOA Scandal, featuring Pam's reforms, Ruth's retired folder, and a brief, careful quote from me about the importance of documentation and speaking up early, even when a conflict feels too small or too petty to justify the effort of proof. I still keep my folder, the original one, tucked in a drawer rather than displayed anywhere, not out of continued fear but out of something closer to respect. For the version of myself who'd sat at that kitchen table months earlier, exhausted and scared, and decided to fight anyway instead of quietly moving away. Mateo and I stayed in touch beyond the case's official close, occasionally trading updates over the same diner coffee that had once felt like crisis meetings and now just felt like friendship between neighbors who'd been through something together. He jokes, sometimes, that Fern Hollow made him a better lawyer than law school did. Brookhaven's gate fountain finally got fixed that summer, ironically funded in part by Deborah's own restitution payments, running properly for the first time in the 11 years Priya had lived there. Nobody mentioned the irony out loud at the small unveiling gathering, but I could see it registering on more than a few faces. Ben started third grade the following fall without a single mention of locked doors, clipboards, or flower ladies, a version of ordinary I genuinely worried, during the worst months, we might never fully get back to. Watching him run into his new classroom without looking back once felt like the real ending of this story. I ran into Deborah's old empty house on a walk one evening, the young family's belongings visible through unshuttered windows, a child's bike leaning against the same porch where a laminated violation notice had once been taped to my door under a completely different pretense. Life, apparently, kept moving forward regardless of who once controlled it. Pam eventually won the HOA presidency in a formal, contested election the following spring, the first genuinely competitive Brookhaven election in over a decade, campaigning openly on the transparency reforms already in place. She called me the night she won, half laughing, half emotional, to say, "We actually did it. It actually held." I reflected, in the quiet months that followed, on how close I'd come to simply moving away instead of fighting, the way Harold and the Ferraros once had, exhausted enough that retreat would have been the easier, safer, more understandable choice. I understood their decisions completely now. I just happened to choose differently. Mateo told me once, near the very end of our formal case relationship, that the thing he respected most wasn't the documentation or the legal strategy, useful as both had been, but the simple, stubborn refusal to accept a version of events someone more powerful was trying to insist was true. That stuck with me. I thought often, during the quieter stretch after sentencing, about the box in that storage unit labeled with my own name, half full, still growing when the search warrant finally stopped it. It was a strange thing to reckon with, the knowledge that I'd been a project, the target, long before I'd understood it. That knowledge changed something permanent in me, not into paranoia exactly, but into a kind of clear-eyed attentiveness I doubted would ever fully fade. I still checked my cameras most nights, not from fear anymore, but from the quiet, hard-earned habit of a woman who'd learned exactly what complacency could cost a family. Ben asked me once, months later, completely unprompted while we were doing dishes together, whether the flower lady was ever going to come back. I told him the truth. Simply, no. She wasn't. Not ever again. And that some grown-ups have to learn the hard way that other people's homes aren't theirs to control. He seemed satisfied with that answer in the straightforward way only children can be, returning immediately to arguing about whether he could have ice cream before bed, the entire ordeal already receding into something closer to a strange story from his past than alive. present fear. I envied that resilience more than I could say. I found myself, that winter, quietly grateful for the specific, almost accidental combination of people who'd made the outcome possible. Pam's conscience, Tyler's spreadsheets, Frank's late honesty, Ruth's decade of patient documentation, Mateo's willingness to take a silly HOA thing seriously from the very first folder I brought into his office. None of it, I understood clearly by then, would have worked without every single piece present at once. Remove any one of them, Pam's audit request, Tyler's guilt, Frank's confession, Ruth's folder, and Deborah Voss might still be standing on some family's porch today, clipboard in hand, laminator warmed up and ready. I started, almost without meaning to, becoming a quiet resource for other people navigating HOA disputes. A neighbor's cousin here, a coworker's friend there, always with the same basic advice. Document everything. Trust your instincts the first time something feels wrong. And never assume a boundary line will protect you on its own. Mateo eventually built an actual pro bono practice around cases like mine, half joking that Fern Hollow had accidentally created a niche legal specialty for him. Turns out, he told me once, a lot of neighborhoods have a Debbie. Most people just never had someone believe them enough to help build the case. I thought, more than once, about writing everything down properly someday. Not for any legal purpose this time. Just as a record, a warning, a small act of witness for anyone else who might one day find a stranger with a clipboard standing in their living room insisting, calmly, that they belonged there. By the time spring came around again, a full year and a half after Deborah first walked uninvited through my front door, Fern Hollow felt, for the first time since I'd moved in, exactly like what the original listing had promised. Quiet, unremarkable, blessedly, thoroughly free of anyone else's rules. It was on an ordinary Thursday, nearly 2 years to the day since I'd first met Deborah Voss on my driveway, that Mateo called with news I hadn't expected. Deborah, granted parole after 18 months as anticipated, had violated a probation condition almost immediately by attempting to purchase a home 2 counties away, near Brookhaven's old sister development. The parole board, reviewing her file, had specifically flagged the attempted purchase given her documented pattern, treating it not as a fresh start but as a potential return to old behavior in disguise. Her application was denied outright, and her probation officer scheduled an emergency check-in to assess compliance more closely going forward. I felt an unexpected chill hearing this, a reminder that whatever peace Fern Hollow had settled into, the person responsible for shattering it in the first place hadn't necessarily changed at all, merely paused. The way a fire smolders quietly under ash before finding fresh air to reignite in. Mateo reassured me the no-contact order protecting my family specifically remained fully intact regardless of where Deborah eventually settled, and that any violation, however small, would trigger immediate consequences given her existing record. Still, I found myself checking my camera app that night more carefully than I had in months. 2 weeks later, my phone buzzed with a notification I hadn't seen in almost a year. Motion detected. Front porch. 11:52 p.m. My stomach dropped instantly, old fear resurfacing faster than I expected it could. I opened the footage with shaking hands, half certain of what, or who, I was about to see. It wasn't Deborah. Dropping a package a full hour late. Apologetic note taped to the box explaining a flat tire. I laughed out loud, alone in my kitchen, half from relief and half from the sheer absurdity of how quickly old fear could resurrect itself over nothing at all. Still, the false alarm reminded me how thin the piece actually was, how easily a single piece of news could pull the whole year's healing back toward the surface. I called my therapist the next morning and scheduled an extra session. Not because anything had actually happened, but because the fear of it happening felt real enough on its own. A month later, Renata Cho's office contacted Matteo directly with an update. Investigators looking into Deborah's older case from 17 years earlier, the one uncovered by the local reporter, had located a second storage unit. This one from her time under her maiden name variant, still paid for quietly through an old account nobody had closed. The second unit, opened under a fresh warrant tied to the parole violation investigation, revealed an even older pattern predating Brookhaven entirely, the same box labeling system, the same obsessive documentation of families she'd targeted decades earlier. Several names investigators were now trying to track down for the very first time. I felt something complicated reading Matteo's summary of the discovery. Not surprise, exactly, but a heavier confirmation that Deborah Voss's need for control hadn't started with Brookhaven and, left unchecked, likely wouldn't have ended there either. Fern Hollow, turned out, had simply been the chapter where someone finally closed the book. The discovery of the second storage unit triggered a parole violation hearing months ahead of schedule, the board citing both the attempted home purchase and the newly uncovered evidence of an even longer, previously unknown pattern of behavior as grounds to reconsider her release conditions entirely. Effective almost immediately, I was asked, along with the other original victims, whether I wanted to submit a statement for the parole hearing specifically. This time, writing it took me only one evening instead of 3 nights. The fear had crystallized into something clearer, easier to name, no longer tangled with the same raw uncertainty as before. At the parole hearing, held months ahead of what anyone expected, the board heard testimony about the second unit, the older uncovered families, and the attempted home purchase, weighing all of it against Deborah's already documented pattern of escalating control disguised as community stewardship stretching back nearly 2 full decades. The board revoked her parole, citing clear and continuing evidence of the exact behavioral pattern the original sentence was intended to address, and ordered her return to custody to serve out the remainder of her original 3-year term, without further possibility of early release consideration this time around. Matteo called me the moment the ruling came down, his voice carrying a satisfaction I hadn't heard from him since the original sentencing. "It's done," he said. "Properly done this time. No loopholes. No early exits. No quiet second act 2 counties over." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table, absorbing it. I told Ben, in age-appropriate terms, that the flower lady had broken a promise she'd made to stay away and would now be gone for even longer than before. He nodded, unbothered, already halfway back to whatever cartoon he'd been watching, the entire matter genuinely, mercifully unremarkable to him by that point. Frank called shortly after the revoked parole, his voice steadier than it had been during our first uncomfortable conversation at my kitchen table over a year earlier. "I used to think loving someone meant defending them no matter what," he said.
I understand now that sometimes the
Pam, still serving as an increasingly popular HOA president, mentioned during a casual call that the reformed board had voted to formally cooperate with investigators tracking down the older, previously unknown victims from Deborah's earlier decades, offering the same organized documentation approach Ruth had once pioneered as a template for the search. I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, offering to help with that outreach effort, drafting a careful, gentle message template for investigators to send to potential older victims, drawing directly on the language that had once felt so difficult to find for my own original victim impact statement 2 years earlier. Ruth joined the effort too, treating it almost as an extension of her retired folder's original purpose, joking that apparently her documentation habit hadn't fully retired after all, just found a new, more official outlet where it could actually help people instead of quietly gathering dust in a drawer nobody looked in. Renata Cho's office eventually located 3 additional families from Deborah's earlier chapter, 2 of whom agreed to participate in a broader civil restitution claim now that the pattern had been formally established in court twice over. The older evidence lending weight neither case could have carried entirely on its own. I felt, watching this wider net slowly close around a pattern stretching back nearly 20 years, a strange sense of belated justice extending backward through time, reaching families who'd given up hope of ever being believed, let alone vindicated, by anyone official enough to matter in the way a court eventually had for me. Mateo told me, during one of our now occasional coffee catch-ups, that the case had become something of a quiet reference point among local attorneys handling similar disputes, cited informally as an example of what sufficiently organized documentation could accomplish even against someone who'd evaded consequences successfully for the better part of 2 decades. I asked him, half joking, whether he ever got tired of HOA cases specifically. He laughed for real this time. Every single one of them starts the same way, he said. Someone insisting it's probably nothing, definitely not worth a lawyer. And every single time, I think about your kitchen table folder. The revoked parole extended Deborah's custody by a full additional 1.5 years beyond the original term. A length that felt, to me at least, like something closer to actual proportional accountability for the scope of harm eventually uncovered across 2 entirely separate chapters of the same relentless, decades-long pattern. I visited Harold once more that year, driving out to see him in person for the first time since our initial phone call, mostly just to sit on his new porch and talk about nothing important. 2 people who'd once been strangers connected only by a shared address and a shared, unlikely relief. I used to think I was weak for running, Harold told me, watching the sunset from his new, quieter street. Now I think I was just tired in a way you weren't yet. You had more left in the tank than I did by the time she got to me. That's not a character flaw. That's just timing. I thought about that conversation often afterward. The idea that courage wasn't a fixed trait some people had and others simply lacked, but something closer to a finite resource, replenished differently for different people at different moments, and that neither Harold's retreat nor my own fight made either of us more or less worthy. The following spring, almost exactly 3 years after Deborah first stood uninvited in my living room, I sold my house on Fern Hollow, not out of fear this time, but simply because a nursing position opened up closer to Ben's new middle school, and the practical math of the move finally made sense. Selling the house felt strange, tangled up with 3 years of memory I hadn't expected to carry when I first bought it. A folder full of laminated notices, a courtroom, a storage unit with my own name on a box, but also Priya's backyard gathering, Ruth's burned pages, Ben's easy laughter returning. The young couple who bought my house asked, during the final walkthrough, why there were so many exterior camera mounts still installed around the property. I told them the honest, condensed version of the story, watching their faces shift from polite curiosity to genuine unease as the details accumulated. You should keep at least the doorbell camera running for the first few months, I told them, only half joking. Not because anything's still wrong here, just because it's good practice, wherever you live, to actually see who's standing at your door before you decide how much trust they've earned. They took the advice seriously. I left Fern Hollow Road with a strange, settled kind of gratitude I hadn't expected to feel toward a street that had put my family through so much. It had also given me Mateo's friendship, Pam's reformed community, Ruth's fierce quiet solidarity, and the certainty that I could survive far more than I'd once believed. Ben, 12 by then, barely remembered the worst of it in any specific detail, just a vague, faded sense memory of once being scared of a fence for reasons he could no longer fully articulate. His therapist called this a genuinely healthy outcome. The fear metabolized fully into an ordinary, unremarkable childhood memory. I kept in touch with Mateo even after the move, our coffee catch-ups shifting to occasional phone calls instead, though he still, to this day, tells the story of my kitchen table folder to new clients as an example of exactly how thoroughly an ordinary person can build an extraordinary case when pushed far enough. Renata Cho's office eventually closed out the broader older victims case with a series of additional plea agreements and restitution orders, expanding Deborah's total financial accountability well beyond the original $80,000 tied specifically to Brookhaven. Though full recovery for every affected family remained, realistically, only ever partial. Pam served 2 full consecutive terms as Brookhaven's president before stepping down voluntarily, citing a desire to let someone else have a turn at something. That isn't a crisis for once, a line that got a genuine, warm laugh at her final community meeting, a kind of laughter Brookhaven hadn't heard much of in years. Frank remarried eventually, a quiet ceremony Priya mentioned hearing about secondhand, describing him as noticeably lighter, more present, the kind of change people sometimes only manage after finally setting down a weight they'd been carrying so long they'd forgotten it wasn't simply part of who they were. Tyler finished his degree in accounting, of all things, and told me once over a brief phone call that he'd chosen the field specifically because he wanted to understand, on a technical level, exactly how the kind of quiet financial harm his mother had inflicted could be caught earlier, faster, by someone paying closer attention. I thought about that choice for a long time afterward. The strange, specific way some people process inherited harm by building their entire adult life around preventing its exact shape from recurring in anyone else's future. A kind of penance that looked, from the outside, almost indistinguishable from simple professional dedication. Ruth passed away peacefully 2 years after my move, and I drove back for her small memorial service, standing again among faces I hadn't seen in years, all of us bound together permanently by a chapter none of us had asked to live through but had, somehow, gotten each other safely to the other side of. At the memorial, someone mentioned that Ruth's old folder, the one we'd partially burned together in my backyard fire pit years earlier, had been formally donated to the County Historical Society as part of a broader archive on HOA governance reform. Her decade of quiet, Patient documentation finally, officially, permanently on the record. It was there, at Ruth's memorial, standing in the same Brookhaven community room where the emergency meeting exposing Deborah had once been held, that I ran into Deborah Voss for the first time since the courtroom. Released now, her final sentence fully served, standing awkwardly near the back entrance alone. She looked older than her actual years, thinner, the confident posture I remembered from that first driveway meeting entirely gone, replaced by something smaller, warier, the posture of a person who'd learned, finally and completely, that the world did not automatically defer to her simply because she insisted it should. I did not approach her, and she did not approach me. The permanent no-contact order technically expired now, but the boundary between us having calcified into something neither of us seemed inclined to test. We simply existed in the same room for a few uncomfortable minutes. Two women reshaped by the same story from opposite ends. Priya, standing beside me, noticed the same thing I had and quietly asked if I wanted to leave. I told her no. Actually, that I wanted to stay exactly where I was, in the community she'd once tried to control, honoring the friend whose documentation had helped stop her, without ceding a single inch of the room. Deborah left after only a few minutes. Alone. No cousin. No Frank. No clipboard. Nobody accompanying her the way an entire neighborhood once had, however uneasily, deferred to her presence. Watching her walk out that door felt like the quietest, least dramatic ending imaginable to a story that had once felt so relentlessly loud. I drove home that evening thinking less about Deborah than about Ruth. About Pam's reforms still holding years later. About Ben now taller than me and utterly unbothered by fences or clipboards or strangers standing too long at curbs. A childhood fully reclaimed from a fear that had once threatened to define it entirely. I understood. Finally, driving home in the dark past the old Brookhaven gate with its properly running fountain, that the story had never really been about a lawn or a mailbox post or even a house at all. It had been about whether ordinary people, tired and scared and outmatched, could still choose to fight anyway. Somewhere behind me, Deborah Voss was living whatever diminished, watchful life remained available to a woman who'd spent decades mistaking control for care and had finally, permanently, run out of neighborhoods willing to mistake it for anything else. Ahead of me, my son was waiting up to hear how the memorial had gone. I told Ben. That night, an age-appropriate version of everything Ruth's memorial, the folder now safely archived, the strange quiet moment of seeing Deborah again after all this time. He listened carefully, the way 12-year-olds sometimes surprise you by doing, and asked simply, "Are you scared of her still?" I thought about the question honestly before answering. "No," I told him. "I used to be. It's finally, completely over." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his homework. The entire saga now firmly filed away as a strange chapter of family history rather than a live, present threat. Looking back on all of it, I think often about the version of me who almost didn't call the locksmith that first night, who almost let the first laminated notice slide, who almost decided a single uninvited visit wasn't worth the exhausting effort of documentation, confrontation, and a fight I never asked for. That version of me existed for a while, tempted daily by the much easier path Harold and the Ferraros had chosen before me, and I understand now, completely and without judgment. Why so many people take that path instead. Fighting cost me a year of sleep, a folder of evidence, and a piece of my son's innocence. But it also gave me something I don't think I could have found any other way. Proof, concrete and undeniable, that a person exhausted and scared and outmatched on paper can still, if she refuses to quit early enough, be the reason an entire pattern of harm finally, permanently stops for good. I think about Pam's dual signature policy sometimes, still quietly running years later according to her last update, catching small discrepancies before they can ever grow into something as large as $80,000 again. Small systems, built out of hard-earned distrust, doing the patient work that no single person's vigilance ever fully could alone. I think about Tyler, an accountant now specifically because of what he learned watching his own mother, turning inherited harm into a kind of quiet, ongoing prevention nobody but the people closest to that story would ever fully understand the weight of. Some penance looks exactly like an ordinary, dedicated career from the outside. I think about Ruth's folder, archived now, outliving her, a permanent record for the next Ruth on the next street who might one day recognize the same pattern faster because someone before her had the patience to write it all down instead of assuming, the way so many of us do, that surely it's nothing. And I think, most often, about that first night, Deborah standing calmly at my bookshelf, clipboard tucked under her arm, a brass key held up between two fingers, like an explanation instead of a confession, and how completely, entirely unrecognizable that moment feels now from the woman who quietly left Ruth's memorial alone. Mateo still texts me occasionally, usually when a new client story starts sounding a little too familiar, a laminated notice, an uninvited visit, a boundary someone insists doesn't apply to them. Another one, he'll write, and I always ask the same question back, do they have a folder started yet? Most of the time, they don't. Not yet. Still in that early stage where the whole thing feels too small, too petty, too embarrassing to take seriously enough to document properly. I always tell Mateo the same thing to pass along. The advice I wish someone had handed me that very first laminated notice morning. Start the folder today. Timestamp everything. Save every notice, even the ones that feel absurd to keep. Trust the instinct the very first time something feels wrong, because that instinct is very rarely actually wrong. However much easier it would be, in the moment, to convince yourself otherwise. Ben is in high school now. Tall, unbothered, occasionally rolling his eyes when I bring up the whole flower lady thing, at family gatherings the way parents do with old stories that have long since lost their power to frighten anyone in the room. That transformation, more than any courtroom outcome, feels like the real victory. I moved twice more after Fern Hollow, each time asking the same blunt question at every open house. Is there an HOA? And if not, has there ever been a dispute about the boundary line? Realtors find the question unusual. I stopped caring how unusual it sounds. I already know exactly what happens when nobody asks it early enough. Priya and I still talk regularly, years and multiple moves later, trading updates on our now teenage kids and the strange, permanent bond formed by having survived the same specific, unlikely chapter of suburban life together, a bond neither of us expected when she first warned me, cryptically, to watch my mail. Pam eventually wrote a short guide for other HOA boards on preventing exactly the kind of concentrated, unchecked control Deborah had wielded for over a decade, distributing it informally through a regional association network. Citing Brookhaven's reforms as a working template other communities could adapt to their own specific situations. I contributed a section to that guide myself. At Pam's request, focus specifically on what residents outside an HOA's actual jurisdiction should do the very first time someone claims authority they don't legally have. Document. Don't engage alone. And never assume a clean deed will protect you without a paper trail backing it up. Harold passed away peacefully some years later. Old age rather than anything dramatic. And I attended his small service too. One more quiet closing of a circle that had started with a stranger's forged signature on paperwork he'd never actually agreed to sign, and ended with a life reclaimed and lived fully on his own terms. I think Harold would have appreciated knowing that his forged signature, once a source of quiet shame he carried for leaving without a fight, ultimately became the exact piece of evidence that unraveled the entire pattern for everyone who came after him. His retreat, in the end, still helped end the thing that chased him out. Deborah Voss, as far as anyone on the Old Fern Hollow group chat has heard, lives quietly now in a small rented apartment 2 counties away. No HO, no board, no clipboard, no neighborhood left willing to hand her the kind of unchecked authority she'd spent decades convincing herself she was entitled to. The consequences of everything she did rippled outward far past the $80,000. Far past her own custody time, into families who moved away too soon, a son who rebuilt his entire career around preventing the same harm, a husband who learned too late what silence costs, and a street that had to relearn trust slowly. But the consequences rippled the other direction too. Quieter but just as real. A reformed HOA still running transparently years later. A folder archived for future use. A guide circulating through regional associations. And a mother and son who came out the other side of it whole. Unbroken. And eventually, genuinely, peace. I don't think about Deborah Voss often anymore. Not out of forgiveness exactly, but out of something closer to simple distance. The natural fading that happens. When a threat that once controlled your every routine finally, permanently, loses its power to reach you at all, wherever it is she happens to be living now. When I do think of her, it's usually not the version from my living room that first terrifying night, but the version from Ruth's memorial years later, smaller, alone, walking out a side door with nobody left willing to defer to her. A final image that feels less like triumph and more like plain, quiet fact. I kept exactly one item from that entire ordeal, tucked now in a drawer in my current house. The brass key Deborah once held up between 2 fingers like it was nothing. The same key I demanded back and had recut immediately after. I don't know why I kept it, but it represented. That key sits now beside Ben's old school photos and a copy of Ruth's donated folder's cover page. Small physical proof that the fight had been real, had been won, and had ultimately, however slowly and imperfectly, made the ground under an entire street a little more solid for whoever came to stand on it next. If there's a single thing I'd want anyone reading this to carry forward, the simple. The boundary line on your deed is real, and it deserves defending, however small or petty or embarrassing the first violation feels. Start the folder early. Trust the wrongness in your gut. Some fights are worth being tired for. Fern Hollow, last I heard, is quiet again. Genuinely quiet this time. No laminated notices. No strange cars at the curb. No clipboard-carrying stranger deciding whose porch light burned too dim on any given Tuesday. Just an ordinary street. Finally, fully, permanently allowed to be exactly what its listing had always promised. And somewhere in a drawer in my current house, next to an old brass key and a folder full of proof, is the quiet, hard-won knowledge that when a stranger walks into your living room and insists, calmly, that she belongs there, you are allowed to say no, and keep saying it until it finally actually sticks. I'm not in any HOA. I never was. Stood in my living room insisting otherwise learned. Eventually, completely, and permanently, exactly why that boundary line had mattered all along.